Okay, everybody, I wanted to just finish up talking a little bit about the digestive system to get you ready for the upcoming practical this week. Remember that you want to be able to state the overall functions of the digestive system, list the digestive organs that you'll ID in lab this week, and state what they do, and distinguish between gastrointestinal and accessory organs. Be able to define the terms in exercise 38, describe the histological features of the alimentary canal, define the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, the serosal, and the GI wall layers. Describe the structures that you'll look for in a slide of the pancreas and liver. ID the types of teeth and know what they do, and the parts of a typical tooth. So, with that said, I know this shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, but you have to eat in order to live. And in order for you to get the benefit that you need out of the food that you consume, you have to mechanically and chemically break it down so that it can be absorbed into the bloodstream and then be carried by the beating action of the heart to all the living tissues in the body. The only way that we live is by extracting the energy that's contained in the chemical bonds in the food that we eat and transferring it into a type of energy currency that the body can understand, and this is ATP. So you can look at the digestive system as a way to process one form of energy into a different form of energy that's immediately available for work, growth, and development. The alimentary canal, or the gastrointestinal tract, digests and absorbs the food. The canal is made up of the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. The accessory digestive organs include the teeth, the tongue, the gallbladder, the salivary glands, the liver, and the pancreas. And on the next slide, what we can see is the entire tract laid out for you from front to back. So when you eat, the trip begins in the mouth. The oral cavity contains the tongue, the salivary glands, and the teeth, as well as the hard palate, soft palate, the rugae on the roof of the hard palate. What happens in the oral cavity is that the food is mechanically and chemically broken down, mostly mechanically broken down by the action of the lips, the tongue, and the teeth. And the idea behind chewing your food, and I know this seems maybe a little silly to some of you, is to provide a greater amount of surface area for the digestive enzymes to act on. If you don't chew your food, what happens is that the chemical portion of digestion is going to be inhibited. Now, the saliva that comes from the parotid, sublingual, and submandibular glands in the oral cavity, you can see them pictured up here, contains an enzyme that actually begins chemical digestion, and that's salivary amylase. And amylase digests starch. And what is starch? Starch are long chains of glucose molecules, so they represent a form of chemical potential energy that are carbohydrates. The saliva also contains antibodies that defend against disease. Also remember from our little discussion on the lymphatic system that the oral cavity is also lined with lymphatic tissue, the tonsils, for instance, standing guard against any pathogens that might happen to work their way from the oral cavity into the pharynx and then down the rest of the alimentary canal. But there are several other antipathogenic safeguards that we'll hit as we move through the alimentary tract, and we'll talk a little bit about those. So as you chew, you increase the surface area of your food. In the oral cavity, of course, the tools of chewing are the teeth. The muscles of chewing include the masseter, to some extent the buccinator, and there are also quite a few muscles that manipulate the tongue, mylohyoid muscles and intrinsic tongue muscles, for instance. Now, the hard palate is a very important structure in this region, too, because it separates the digestive from the respiratory tract. And if the hard palate weren't present, the nasal cavity and the oral cavity would be one single chamber. And the problem, of course, with that arrangement, it would be very difficult to eat without taking food down into the respiratory tract. So there is a condition that affects the formation of the hard palate known as cleft palate, where the palatine processes of the maxilla as well as the palatine bones fail to seal at midline on the roof of your mouth. And the result is often surgical correction. It can present as as mild a phenotype as hair lip or as extreme a phenotype as having a single opening for both the nose and the mouth. And that has to be corrected through craniofacial surgery. So as you chew and you swallow, okay, what happens now is that as soon as the food is forced as a result of voluntary muscle constriction down into the oropharynx, it's going to pass into the laryngopharynx. At the same time, the epiglottis is going to close over the glottis. Remember that the glottis is basically the doorway to the upper respiratory system that lies just behind, just underneath the larynx, that's bordered by your vocal cords. Also, what happens is that the soft palate will assist to some extent to direct the food down the esophagus, which runs, remember, behind the trachea, as opposed to having food enter the windpipe. And we probably all experience that at some point. It's an extremely unpleasant experience. You cough and you hack, and eventually the food is going to end up down in the lower respiratory, but it's not designed to accommodate those mass substances. What happens as you swallow is that the esophagus will begin to take over. The upper two-thirds of the esophagus are lined with skeletal muscle, which is innervated to perform what we call peristaltic movements. These are wave-like contractions of muscle. And the last third of the esophagus, down around here, is lined with smooth muscle that continues the same action. What happens is this wet food ball, known as a bolus, will eventually move through a ring of muscular tissue down here called the lower esophageal sphincter, where it will enter the stomach. Now, the stomach is a wonderful organ because the stomach allows us to do something that we probably all take for granted, which is engage in discontinuous feeding, which means that we can eat a meal and then stop and carry out our activities of daily living without having to constantly feed ourselves. There are organisms that don't have stomachs, and they have to constantly eat in order to live. An earthworm is an example of an organism without a stomach, so to speak. In the event that the lower esophageal sphincter does not properly close as the bolus enters the stomach chamber, what will happen is that the stomach will begin its normal process of digestion, which includes muscular contraction of three walls of smooth muscle that line this organ, a longitudinal, oblique, and a circular layer, as well as secretion of pepsin, which is a protease, hydrochloric acid, which is an extremely corrosive liquid, and also at the same time mucus to help protect the stomach lining. And in the event that the stomach begins mixing this food and the lower esophageal sphincter doesn't seal, the acid can reflux up into the esophagus and can cause it to scar. And if this is a persistent condition, eventually the esophagus can almost close off. This is a condition called Barrett's esophagus, and it can result in difficulty swallowing that can lead to emesis or vomiting. Now, in the stomach, what happens is that the hydrochloric acid serves to chemically digest the food because it's a very powerful hydrolytic substance, while the pepsin is a very potent protease. And so what happens now is that the bolus will gradually become a semi-solid liquid that will eventually be introduced into the duodenum, which is the first 10 inches of the small intestine down here. But essentially the stomach is like a big mixing bowl. What happens as the bolus begins to break apart mechanically and chemically is that we provide now more surface area for future enzyme activity. At the same time, it serves as a way to sterilize the food that's coming from the esophagus. So it's really helping you out two different ways. Now, the duodenum is kind of mission critical for the digestive system because in the duodenum, what we have really are four organs that contribute secretions to this extremely important juncture in the digestive system. One is the liver by way of the gallbladder, and the gallbladder empties directly into the duodenum as it fuses with the pancreatic duct and forms a widened chamber called the hepatopancreatic ampulla. And this is basically where the bile duct and the pancreatic duct intersect. And there is a sphincter called the sphincter of Oddi that will open up to allow both the bile and the pancreatic exocrine secretions to enter this first 10 inches of the duodenum, just ahead of the chyme coming from the stomach. So we've got the liver, the gallbladder, the stomach, and the pancreas all kind of pitching in at the same point here. So let's talk a little bit about the pancreas first. Okay, we'll take these in order. The pancreas is what's called an accessory organ of digestion, just as the salivary glands, the gallbladder, and the liver are. And what it does in its exocrine role is it produces three classes of digestive enzymes that are aimed at each of the macromolecules present in the food that you eat. Remember that all the food that you eat can be broken up into three basic chemical classes: the fats or lipids, the carbohydrates or the sugars, and the proteins. And the pancreas generates secretions that will chemically break apart all three. Pancreatic lipase will attack fat, pancreatic amylase will attack starch, and there are several proteases that are produced by the pancreas: chymotrypsin, trypsin, carboxypeptidase, just to name a few, that are proteases that overlap in specificity and will cleave different parts of the amino acid chain that makes up the proteins in the food that you eat, so that eventually the protein will be broken all the way down into its component parts, which are the amino acids. So the pancreas is pretty important in order for you to be able to capably digest your food. Now there's another organ that also chips in, which is the liver by way of the gallbladder. One of the jobs of the liver is to create bile. Okay, bile are basically organic salts that serve a detergent function in the duodenum, and they're generated by the liver, stored in the gallbladder, where they're concentrated up to 20 times by the removal of water while they sit in this little sac. And as food is coming from the stomach, just ahead of that, what happens is that there is a hormone called cholecystokinin that will signal the gallbladder to squeeze, and it will release the bile along with the pancreatic juice into the duodenum just slightly ahead of the chyme. And another very important secretion we should point out and not forget about and when we're talking about the pancreas is large amounts of bicarbonate are produced in the pancreas as well. So what's happening here in the duodenum is that the chyme that comes from the stomach is very acidic because it's got a lot of hydrochloric acid in it. And when it hits the bicarbonate that's coming from the pancreas, that's part of the pancreatic juice, the hydrochloric acid will be neutralized, and that'll reduce the wear and tear on the duodenum. At the same time, the bile will serve to emulsify the fats that are in the food that you've eaten and break up large lipid droplets into tinier droplets that are easily digested by the pancreatic lipase. So the gallbladder and the pancreas kind of work as a team to break down fat. You have to have the bile salts there to kind of increase the surface area so that the lipase can really get the job done effectively. What happens then is that this chyme will slowly be degraded into its component parts. The proteins will eventually be broken down into amino acids. The polysaccharides will eventually be broken down into monosaccharides. And the fats will be broken down into their component parts, which are glycerol and fatty acids. And those will be absorbed across the walls of the small intestine. The next segment of the small intestine is called the jejunum, okay? And it's about 12 feet long or so. And it's where most of the nutrient absorption takes place in the small intestine, although a considerable amount happens in the ileum as well. And if we were to open up the duodenum and the jejunum, we would notice something very interesting about the inner lining of this tube, which is that there's a lot of modifications in this tube that are designed to increase surface area. Among those are, as you can already see, the folding of the small intestine upon itself. If we look inside a section of small intestine, we'll see little circular folds running along the length of the duodenum and through some of the jejunum, which are called plicae circulares. And these are designed to allow the chyme, as it rolls through the small intestine, to make a lot of contact with the walls of the small intestine, which is desirable because that represents the opportunity to absorb the nutrients. And then if we were to look at those circular folds, what we would see upon them are finger-like projections called villi, which are also there to increase the surface area of the small intestine. And then if we really got serious about examining the lining of the small intestine, which we will a little bit later on, what we would see is that the cells that line the villi that are on the end that's closest to the lumen, the part where the food shoots through, they are made up of simple columnar epithelia, which contain on their apical end microvilli. And as a result, what you've got now are four modifications designed to increase surface area taking place in a single organ. And the reason that this happens is because we have a lot of transport and secretion work to do in a very tiny volume. So it's not a surprise that we see these kinds of tissue modifications in this region in order for that to happen effectively. Now the next thing that will occur is that we'll work our way through the jejunum. The nutrient content of the chyme will begin to decrease. As we reach the ileum, it'll become less and less and less. And by the time we get all the way to the junction between the small and the large intestine, which is here at the ileocecal valve, where the ileum joins the cecum, which is the first part of the large intestine, we've got basically just waste products. And so what will happen now, and the food, remember, is being propelled all this time as a result of peristaltic contractions, smooth muscle that squeezes this stuff through the tube. What will happen now is that this waste product will enter the large intestine, and in here live thousands and thousands of bacteria called E. coli. And what they do is they feed off of the waste products that are left over from the food that we eat. And as a result, they get metabolic energy while at the same time they produce byproducts that are very important for us, such as vitamin K and some of the B complex vitamins that are absorbed across the walls of the large intestine and into the bloodstream. In the colon, what happens is that the waste material has its water content adjusted as it's propelled along, first from the cecum to the ascending, then to the transverse, and to the descending, and then to the sigmoid colon, and then finally out the rectum to the anus, and that's the end of the trip. So as the fecal material moves along, the water content will begin to decrease as we try to recover now some of that vital fluid while leaving behind the waste products. These little pouches that you see running along the large intestine are called haustra, and they're caused by contractions of what remains of the smooth muscle tissue in the large intestine, which is this little strap of tissue called the Tenier coli. So in terms of muscularity, the large intestine is a lot less muscular than the small intestine, the esophagus, and the stomach are. But the waste material does eventually make it down to the rectum and the anus, where the act of defecation eliminates it. Now, maybe you've noticed by looking at this diagram that actually you can kind of think of your body almost as a walking donut. You have a tube that runs through you that goes from the mouth to the anus, and the food that you eat really isn't inside your body until it's absorbed across the walls of the small intestine and enters the blood that is going to eventually be drained from all of this tissue and will end up actually coming back to this organ here, the liver. Okay, the liver receives nutrient-rich blood via the hepatic portal vein that actually comes in the back door of the liver. And what the liver will do is it will clean and chemically adjust the content of this blood, and it'll either store that fuel as fat or as animal starch, which we know as glycogen, or if the body needs it right away for metabolic purposes, it will allow a lot of that fuel to head on through the liver and via the hepatic vein, which is kind of up here right next to the inferior vena cava, eventually re-enter the circulatory system, head back towards the heart, where the heart will pump it throughout the body. So that's basically how the nutrients are circulated. So that's the trip from front to back. Very important that it work properly all the time. And of course, there's all kinds of problems that can happen anywhere along the way. We've already talked about acid reflux and Barrett's esophagus. Obviously, in your mouth, one of the things that can happen is dental caries or cavities, and this is because there's a lot of bacteria that live in your mouth that also live off the food that you eat, and they produce organic acids. They can eat through the enamel on your teeth, and from there, the dentin is very soft tissue that can decay. And the reason that this presents a danger to your health is not only is it painful, but remember that inside the teeth, as we're going to see, are a lot of nerves and blood vessels, and if bacteria gets into the blood, that's really bad news. In the stomach, what can happen is that there are a very special type of bacteria called Helicobacter pylori that can hitch a ride on the food and drink that you consume and can make it all the way down into the stomach. And what they can do is they can actually adhere to the gastric mucosa and inflame it, causing it to bleed. And this is a condition called an ulcer. In the event that the inflammation and the combined action of the stomach acid produce enough damage to the tissue, it can potentially perforate. A perforated ulcer is a medical emergency because now your stomach acid will leak out into your abdominal pelvic cavity and digest your internal organs. But the fun doesn't stop there. There's also problems that you can encounter with the gallbladder. The gallbladder, of course, is the area where bile is concentrated. And in the course of concentrating the bile, sometimes what can happen is that the bile salts can actually crystallize, form little solid rocks, and these are called gallstones. These gallstones can lodge in the duct that leads out of the gallbladder into the bile duct called the cystic duct, and then when the food comes down from the stomach into the duodenum, um, when the gallbladder squeezes under its command from CCK, it can produce intense pain. Sometimes these gallstones can lodge in the hepatopancreatic ampulla and impinge the movement not only of bile but also of pancreatic juice into the pancreatic ampulla and through the sphincter of Oddi. And this can inflame not only the gallbladder but also the pancreas, and that's a condition called pancreatitis. Okay. Now, in the small intestine, um, as we age, sometimes what happens is that the wall of the small intestine weakens because we lose muscle tone, and you can have little outpouchings of the small intestine in which food can become lodged and begin to ferment and produce pain. This is a condition known as Crohn's disease, okay, or um, sometimes milder forms called diverticulosis, which are the actual pouches that occur along the length of the GI, and if they inflame, that's called diverticulitis. Okay, so think of those as little blind alleys that can occur all along the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Okay, so as we age, that's something that we want to look out for. And then, of course, the appendix is the home to lots and lots of bacteria, and we know that those bacteria are important because they produce vital components that are absorbed into the bloodstream that keep us happy and healthy. But occasionally what can happen is that fecal material can become jammed in this little blind sac down here. This is your appendix, and it can begin to fill with gas and inflame, and if it ruptures, then fecal material can be sprayed all over the inside of the abdominal pelvic cavity, and that can cause the lining of the abdominal pelvic cavity called the peritoneum to inflame, and that's called peritonitis. And if the bacteria get into the blood, that can cause septicemia, which can lead to multiple organ failure. Okay, and then, of course, some more common problems that exist in the large intestine. Everybody's probably experienced constipation or diarrhea. Constipation is where the fecal material sits too long in the large intestine, too much water is reabsorbed, and as a result, the stool doesn't pass very freely. Whereas diarrhea is where the waste products move through the large intestine too quickly, not enough water is reabsorbed, and as a result, the stool has an extremely liquid texture. The passageway out of the body is guarded by an internal and an external anal sphincter. The external anal sphincter, of course, we control that skeletal muscle. The internal anal sphincter is smooth muscle. So that's the whole trip. And this is just a picture showing you what we've discussed. So no real news here. The only thing I would add is that the fats, as they're absorbed back into the body, don't actually go straight into the bloodstream. They're instead introduced into special lymphatic vessels called lacteals, which are embedded just beneath the the mucosa in the submucosal layer uh, of the lining of the gut. And these structures, these lacteals, are there to pick up very special combinations of fat and protein, which are classified as either chylomicrons, low density lipoproteins, very low density lipoproteins, or high density lipoproteins. And that's one of the things measured when you have your blood cholesterol and triglycerides checked. And essentially, an indicator of your overall health is the percentage of good versus bad cholesterol that you have in your blood. If you have a high percentage of chylomicrons, VLDLs, and LDLs, that generally means that you're not eating a healthy diet, you're not exercising sufficiently, and as a result, you're going to tend to put on bad weight, and that can have a tremendous impact on your cardiovascular fitness, can lead to diabetes and also hypertension, as well as a host of other conditions. This is just a cross section through the alimentary canal. This could be, for instance, taken from the jejunum as an example. Okay, and what you want to be able to do is, on a diagram like this, be able to identify each of the layers, but also be able to identify them on a slide. And we'll see a slide in just a minute. But you can see here as we work from the inside out that we've got very distinct types of tissues that do a very particular job. So if we start here with the lumen, that's just the hole through which the food moves. And then this superficial layer is called the mucosa, okay, and it's made up of an epithelial layer. Remember that epithelial tissue tends to line the inside and outside of organs, as well as the surfaces of your body. Has very little extracellular matrix. In this case, the purpose of the epithelium is for absorption and secretion. So it contains a lot of brush border enzymes that help break down chemically the food that you consume. It also contains a considerable number of goblet cells which produce mucus that also help lubricate the food and allow it easy passage through the tube. The lamina propria is connective tissue that lies just underneath the epithelium, and it is basically to seal the uh, the epithelial tissue to the underlying tissue. Again, remember the connective tissue's job primarily is it serves as the glue of the body. And then beneath that is the muscularis mucosa, and it's a layer of smooth muscle that allows the villi to kind of move as the food moves through the tube so that you increase the amount of surface area. And it's innervated by the enteric nervous system because remember, smooth muscle is involuntary. Now, the submucosa is beneath the muscularis mucosa, and it is also connective tissue. It also has large numbers of glands in the submucosa um, that are designed to produce secretions that end up in the lumen. Okay, things like mucus that protect the stomach lining, as an example. You'll also see, um, I wanted to point this out earlier while we were in the mucosa, that there are lymphatic nodules that are stationed um, in the mucosa that are called Peyer's patches, okay, or malt, depending on where we are in the tube. And what they do is protect the bloodstream from invasion by pathogens. And notice that they're stationed in this first layer of connective tissue between the muscularis mucosa and the epithelial tissue, and they stand guard essentially if any pathogens pass through this first layer of tissue. It keeps it from getting into the bloodstream. And then as we move out here, remember we got epithelial tissue, we've got connective tissue here, we've got smooth muscle tissue here, okay? And then we've got the submucosa, which is connective tissue, and some glands, okay? Quite a few glands in the submucosa. And then we've got the muscularis externa, and it's arranged in most places in the intestine as either an internal circular and an outer longitudinal layer of smooth muscle, and its job, as it's innervated by the enteric nervous system, is to help move the food through the pipe. Okay, so this is the propulsion for the food, while this is engaging in increasing the amount of contact that the food has with the lining of the intestine. And then on the very outside layer, okay, what you have is serosa, okay, and the serosa is made up of epithelial tissue that secretes a lubricating fluid that allows the intestines to move without rubbing against associated structures and producing irritation and inflammation, and an underlying layer of connective tissue that seals it to the smooth muscle. So again, remember that an organ is different tissues acting as a team in order to perform a particular job. And so what you've seen here is a lot of different tissues all working together in order to help you mechanically and chemically digest your food. You've got muscle tissue to help propel the food through and increase contact with the lumen's lining. You've got epithelial tissue that produces secretion and also absorbs the nutrients. You've got the extensive vascularization of the submucosa, as well as the villi that line the lumen, and that's to pick up the nutrient-rich blood and eventually transport it to the rest of the body. And that's a type of, remember, liquid connective tissue. You've got the nerves that innervate the muscle tissue that basically trigger the contraction. And then you've got epithelial tissue that helps lubricate the outer layer of the GI, keep it from rubbing and irritating. And finally, um, you've got glandular tissue that's involved in creating large amounts of secretions that are important in digesting the food as well as protecting the lining of the stomach. So a lot of different tissues pitching in here to do a job. The connective tissue, notice, is between each layer, right? We've got epithelial, connective, muscle, muscle, connective, and epithelial, okay, if you wanted to group it. And then you can see scattered among there, obviously, connective tissue in the form of blood and nervous tissue as well in between each layer. So, one important note before we move on from this slide, note that the outermost layer of the tract is termed serosa below the diaphragm in the abdominal pelvic cavity, whereas in the area above the diaphragm it's called adventitia. Adventitia secretes a lot less lubricating fluid. It's more of a fibrous connective tissue than serosa does. Okay, so just be aware of that. Depending on where you are, it's going to look a little bit different. Now, this is a lining of the upper esophagus, and you want to note that the innermost layer is made up of non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and skeletal muscle dominates the top 2/3 of the muscularis externa of the esophagus. Although it is not consciously innervated in that region, it is still skeletal muscle. If you look at it, you will see striations under the microscope. Smooth muscle dominates the lower third of the esophagus. But again, if we look very closely at this diagram, we can see here epithelial tissue. Now, you might ask, why is it non-keratinized? Okay, and why is it stratified? Good, both good, very good questions. Okay. Well, the reason that it's stratified as opposed to simple tissue is because stratified tissue is tougher stuff, so it's less likely to rip as the food passes through the lumen. The reason that it's non-keratinized is so that it's smoother and it allows the food easier passage down the pipe from the pharynx ultimately to the stomach. You can see the muscle tissue here in the outer layer, and then if you look very closely, you can see connective tissue dominating now the layers in between the epithelium and the muscularis externa. Okay, and then if we looked real close, you could see submucosa all along here, and that's pretty much it. This outer layer here is the epithelial adventitia, which is, again, epithelial and connective tissue acting together. Now, the stomach is a very important organ. It's where a lot of chemical and mechanical digestion takes place. And it's got several features. Now, I don't want you to confuse a feature with a layer. Okay, so let's hit the features first. This domed upper portion is called the fundus. This big curve right here is called the greater curvature. This is the lesser curvature. And then this area here where we begin to narrow is what we call the pyloric antrum, okay, which leads to the pyloric canal and then into the pyloric sphincter, which is the door out of the stomach, whereas the cardiac or lower esophageal sphincter is the doorway into the stomach, okay. The reason it's called cardiac sphincter or cardial portion is because it's near the heart, okay. So just think about where the stomach is, and that'll make a lot of sense to you. Now, if we look at the tissues that dominate the stomach, let's work from the outside in. The serosa, again, dominates this organ because it's below the diaphragm, and the stomach does a lot of movement, so it needs a lube job. And the serosa produces the serous fluid that allows it to slip and slide as it churns the food with the gastric secretions. And remember, the serosa is both connective tissue and epithelial tissue. The epithelial tissue on the most superficial portion, the connective tissue just underneath it. And then beneath that, you got 3 layers of muscle tissue. Okay, you've got a longitudinal layer that's most superficial, a circular layer that's between, and an oblique layer that's the innermost muscularis externa. And then as we move further in, okay, what you can see now are the the gastric lining, okay, the gastric mucosa. And remember that that is going to be dominated by, at its most superficial part, simple columnar epithelial tissue. And we're going to get a zoom in on this in the next slide. And notice that these little ridges here, okay, run all along the stomach. These are called rugae. And what they do is they disappear as the stomach expands. So the stomach can shrink or grow depending on how much food is in it. It's a very distensible organ. And it's basically there to allow the contents that came from the esophagus to mix with the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin and the mucus, of course, that the stomach secretes to protect it from its own acid as the food is chemically digested. And then what will happen is that the food will leave the stomach through the pyloric sphincter and enter those first 10 inches of the small intestine, the duodenum. Now, if we look at the stomach lining, what we can see here are gastric pits that lead way down into the gastric mucosa, leading to these gastric glands, okay? And the way to differentiate a gland from a pit, it's kind of fuzzy, but if you see branching, okay, in the slide, that would be the part that we would qualify as a gland, whereas this upper portion that's just a simple opening through the tissue that you might see in a slide, that would qualify as a pit. And what, again, does the mucosa do? Well, it secretes stuff, okay? Not very much absorption goes on in the stomach, save for certain drugs and sometimes significant amounts of alcohol if you're a heavy drinker. But the parietal cells and the chief cells produce the secretions that help the stomach really do its digestion job, which is to bust up the chemical components of the food that you eat. The parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid, while the chief cells secrete the pepsin. And in a very interesting sort of strategy, what the stomach does when it produces the pepsin, it actually produces it as an inactive enzyme inside the cells, inside the chief cells, and then as it hits the acid environment of the stomach, certain chemical bonds in the pepsin are cleaved, and now it's an active protease. And the reason for that, is so that you don't activate the pepsin too soon and degrade the cell that produces the secretion. Otherwise, the lining of the stomach would break down very quickly. There's also a lot of mucus cells in the stomach. The alkaline mucus protects the stomach from its own secretions. And then, of course, you can see connective tissue just underneath the epithelial layer. Again, doing what connective tissue does, which is to hold the other tissue types to each other. It's also significantly vascularized. Okay, this is just a look at the area leading from the stomach to the small intestine to the large intestine. You can see here where the pyloric antrum leads into the pyloric sphincter, leading to the duodenum, which leads into the jejunum, which leads to the ileum, which connects directly up to the cecum, and then we can ascend the ascending colon. Okay. Notice that we have a lot of mesentery that is attached to the small intestine and large intestine, and the blood that drains from the mesentery, the vessels that are in the mesentery, head straight to the liver. Okay, and it's the liver's job then to deal with that blood, to chemically adjust it so that it can then be sent on to the rest of the body. The liver removes toxins. The liver again adjusts the nutrient content to the blood, and it also is a major producer of plasma proteins, such as albumin, that allow the blood to hold on to a lot of its water. Okay, so the liver does a whole lot for your body to keep you alive, in addition, of course, to making bile. You can see again the contrast between the small intestine that has, again, the intercircular and outer longitudinal muscular layers with the simple Tenia coli that dominates the large intestine. Okay, here in the ascending colon, and down here in the cecum, and there's of course your appendix again. Now this is just a look at a cross section through typical region of small intestine. Okay, and this figure is just designed to show you the different major layers. Okay, and what you expect to find if you're examining um, the lining of the small intestine in detail. So here are the villi, okay, these finger-like projections here, and they're dominated by simple columnar epithelium with the goblet cells that produce the mucus, and the columnar epithelium, which contains brush border enzymes that help activate a lot of the proteases so that they can finish up digesting the protein, while also providing significant amounts of surface area across which these simple molecules can absorb and enter the bloodstream, while the fats, of course, enter these green things here, the lacteals, which are part of the lymphatic system. Now, what happens next is that nutrient-rich blood is going to head to the liver, where the liver will either store it as glycogen or fat, or will allow that blood to proceed on to the rest of the body for use in metabolism. Underneath this simple columnar epithelia, you can see the lacteals, you can see the capillaries, and you can also see the MALT, the mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, that is your intestine's defense against invaders that manage to make it past the stomach. And there are a significant number of bacteria that can survive that acid bath, the Helicobacter pylori being a prime example. Okay, and then beneath here in the malt, okay, you can see here uh, the area basically going from the muscularis mucosa up to the epithelial tissue. That is the mucosal layer. Okay, that is the mucosal layer. And then you've got this dividing line here at the muscularis mucosa, and then underneath you've got the submucosa. You can still see malt in here, and you can see lots and lots of duodenal glands. Okay, and we'll see that in some of the slides that we'll examine in a bit. But again, this is a tissue that's designed for secretion and absorption, for increasing surface area as much as possible, and for propelling the food on its journey. Okay, duodenal glands are going to dominate tissue that's taken from the duodenum, whereas in the ileum, what you're going to see are submucosal associated lymphatic tissue known as Peyer's patches, which are going to be dark purple staining areas that you'll see as we move on to the rest of the presentation. You want to be able to identify all the different structures in this model. You want to be able to pick out the villi, the capillaries, the muscularis mucosa, the muscularis externa, both layers, the submucosa. Okay, not anything that should be surprising to you if you examine closely the figure that we just discussed. Now, this is a model, or a diagram showing you the large intestine, and you can see the cecum, the ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid colon, the rectum, and the anus. You can see the Tenia coli, that's the smooth muscle that helps propel things along, and the haustra, which are these little pouches here all along the tract, are produced by the actual contraction of the Tenia coli. There is the vermiform appendix. Okay, that's an area a lot of lymphatic tissue, also lots of bacteria live in that region and throughout the gut. And the major bacteria that lives in the gut is named for where it lives, and that's E. coli. Okay, and remember, we have a symbiotic relationship with those bacteria. You can see the mesentery again that is connected to the large intestine. You want to know the right and left colic flexures and their nicknames, right? The hepatic flexure is called that because it's near the liver. The splenic flexure is near the spleen. Okay, that's where it gets its name from. And again, the mesentery is primarily connective tissue with nerves, blood vessels, and lymphatics running through it that serves this organ and also drains the blood and takes it back up to the liver. Okay, now if we take a look here at a section of large intestine, what you see is very interesting histological features. You can, here is the lumen of the small intestine. This is again where the waste products would be. Notice that the simple columnar epithelium has lots of goblet cells in here. And what do goblet cells produce? They produce mucus, and the mucus helps lubricate the fecal material as it slides through the large intestine. But notice that you don't have lots and lots of villi, not nearly to the extent that you had in the small intestine. The reason for that is that we're not doing a lot of absorbing and secreting in this region. We're just adjusting the water content of the fecal material. So our job is basically to reabsorb the water, a significant number of the electrolytes, lubricate the fecal material, and move it through this region as quickly as we possibly can. The lamina propria is the area just beneath the epithelial tissue. Again, it's dominated by connective tissue, and you can see the muscularis mucosa here, the smooth muscle layer that again um, allows a lot of contact of the fecal matter with the lining of the large intestine, and of course the submucosa beneath it. And you will find also throughout the large intestine, if you look very closely in the submucosal regions, um, lymphatic tissue as well. Okay. Now, if we sort of work our way back up to the other end of the digestive system, what we can see here in the oral cavity is the structure of your typical tooth. Okay, so what are teeth for? They're tools, right? And if you smile, look in the mirror and smile, Mother Nature is telling you what it is you should eat. If you notice in the front of your mouth, you've got these broad, flat teeth that are called incisors. They're for slicing and chopping. Um, they are bordered by your canine teeth, the pointy teeth. Sometimes you nickname them your fangs, and they're for slashing and cutting. And then you've got premolars and molars behind those teeth, and they're designed primarily for grinding. And that is the mouth of an omnivore. Okay, that's Mother Nature telling you should be eating equal parts meat and vegetable matter because that's the tool chest you've been provided with. If you look at the mouth of an herbivore, which you can do if you Google a cattle skull or a dog skull, dog skull will be a carnivore, cattle skull will be an herbivore. You get very different dentition. In the cattle skull, you see primarily incisors and molars because what do they eat all day? Grass, vegetable matter. Whereas in the canine dentition, you see primarily incisors and canines and very few molars, and that's again dentition designed to consume meat, protein. Okay, so Mother Nature is telling you should be an omnivore. You should eat a balanced diet. Now, if we look at the cross section of a tooth, what you can see is the portion that sits above the gum line is the crown, and it's covered by a very hard substance known as enamel. Its purpose is to retard degradation of the teeth, but there are bacteria, of course, that live in your mouth and feed off of the organic material in the oral cavity, producing acids that eat their way through the enamel, which can eventually erode the enamel to the point where we get into the dentin. The dentin is much softer material, and if the bacteria get into the dentin, it can very easily get to the pulp cavity, which, as you can see, contains a lot of nerves and blood vessels. And it's getting to the blood vessels that would be a really dangerous situation for somebody with advanced dental caries, because once the bacteria in the blood, then you have the potential of carrying it to all the other organs in the body. Okay, you can go septic. The area where the crown meets the gingiva or gums is called the neck, and notice that the enamel stops at the neck. And all we have is cementum from that point on lining this portion of the tooth. And the cementum is not nearly as powerful a retardant against bacterial decay as the enamel is. And so if you are engaged in poor dental hygiene, you don't brush and floss regularly, what can happen as the bacterial plaque builds up on the enamel is it can inflame the gums, called gingivitis. Okay, the gums can bleed and they can recede, and if they recede, the bacteria can work its way under the enamel into the dentin of the tooth, and at that point you're in danger of having a cavity that could go all the way either to the root canal here or to the pulp cavity. The tooth is held in place by periodontal ligaments forming a very special joint called a gomphosis. The gingiva, of course, are the soft tissue that line the upper and lower jaw that come right up to the gingival sulcus, which is where the crown meets the gingiva at the neck and protects the rest of the tooth. Um, and I think that's pretty much everything there. So um, be good to your teeth. You know, you only get 2 sets. You don't want to have to pay for that third set, and you'll live a much longer and happier life. So brush at least 3 times a day and floss regularly. That's anything that a good dentist would tell you. Be able to recognize the different types of teeth based on their shape, know all these features, and know what jobs that tooth is doing. Okay. Also know the difference between deciduous teeth and permanent teeth, right? Your deciduous or your baby teeth are called that because they fall out. You get 20 of those total, where your permanent teeth, 32 in number, are supposedly your last set. Sometimes the third molars, known as the wisdom teeth, have to be extracted in the early 20s because they don't often come in vertically. Instead, they try to come in horizontally, and this can cause your bite to lose its alignment in a condition known as malocclusion. And what we have to do then is extract those teeth so that your bite remains normal, and that involves a visit to the oral surgeon where he will basically slice the gums open and pull the teeth out with pliers, and then he will provide you with pain medication and allow those gums to slowly heal, and that'll be the end of that episode. Hopefully that's the last time you have to ever go see the oral surgeon. Now, the salivary glands, also located in the oral cavity, produce secretions that help lubricate the food, but also begin a little bit of chemical digestion in the mouth. The mucus glands in the salivary tissue produce mucus, while the serous glands produce a clear enzyme-rich fluid that aids in chemical digestion. The parotid glands, located here, lateral to the mandible, just outside the masseter, are primarily concerned with producing serous secretions. The submandibular glands, the ones below the jaw, produce mixed secretions, both mucus and enzyme-rich secretions, while the sublinguals, which are under the tongue, you can see those here, produce mostly mucus secretions. But what is the purpose of those secretions? The mucus lubricates the food, while the serous secretions are primarily there to moisten it and to facilitate limited chemical digestion of what enters the oral cavity. And this is just a peek at the liver, the gallbladder, and the duodenum working as a team. These aren't anything that we haven't already talked about. You should know where the right and left hepatic ducts are. They bring the bile that the liver makes down into the common hepatic duct, which dumps into the cystic duct, and in the gallbladder, that's where the bile gets concentrated. When food is coming from the stomach, what will happen is that the gallbladder will squeeze and will send bile into the cystic duct down into the bile duct, which will fuse here with the pancreatic duct, and this little sphincter, known as the sphincter of Oddi, controls the passage of both the pancreatic juice and the bile into the duodenum, and this little sort of pimple, this little bulge here on the wall of the duodenum, is called a papilla. A papilla is just a finger-like projection. Okay, so you want to know the papilla, you want to know the hepatopancreatic ampulla, which is the widened chamber where these two ducts come together, and you want to know the sphincter, the hepatopancreatic sphincter, also sometimes called the sphincter of Oddi, O-D-D-I. Now, if we were to look at pancreatic tissue under a microscope, you would see um, tissue that's involved both in the exocrine and the endocrine function of the pancreas. The endocrine function of the pancreas is dominated by the islet cells, which produce both insulin and glucagon. And insulin, remember, is a hormone that's designed to reduce blood sugar levels after a meal and allow the cells either to take it up out of the bloodstream and use it for energy or to store it as fat, while the glucagon that's secreted by the islet cells does the opposite. It mobilizes glucose that's stored in the form of glycogen or promotes the breakdown of fat uh, and the execution of a process known as gluconeogenesis, which literally means to make new sugar from those stores so that you can have enough blood sugar to fill your metabolic needs between meals. But the thing to look for in pancreatic tissue is always to look for these islets, because that'll be a dead giveaway. And they're surrounded by these acinar cells. And what the acinar cells produce are the enzymes that populate the pancreatic juice, the pancreatic lipase, the pancreatic amylase, and of course the pancreatic proteases that we talked about earlier as well. And remember that the proteases are also primarily made as zymogens, meaning that they're inactive in the pancreatic organ itself. They don't activate really until they hit the lumen of the duodenum, where the brush border enzymes turn them on so that they can begin chemically digesting the food. Otherwise, the pancreas would digest itself, and that's a very dangerous situation. So, be able to recognize pancreatic tissue under the microscope. Now, the liver is kind of like a miracle of God, and what the liver does is it performs a lot of functions that keep you alive. Um, there are hepatocytes, literally liver cells, that populate most of the volume of the organ, and they line these irregular blood-filled spaces called sinusoids. Sinusoid means something like a sinus. Okay, what is a sinus? It's just an irregular open area inside an organ. And what the liver's job is to do is to basically chemically treat your blood. It receives nutrient-rich blood that drains from the small and large intestine, and it will extract the nutrients from it and store it either as glycogen or fat, or allow it to head on through the liver tissue into the rest of the body in the event that the body needs it for nutrition. It also produces a lot of the blood proteins, primarily albumin, made in the liver here, that helps the blood hold on to its fluid content, and it is a major detoxifier of the blood. It's where a lot of alcohol is oxidized, a lot of drugs are oxidized. Um, so without your liver, you'd be in a really very bad way. And what you're looking at here with the organization of this tissue is a tissue that looks like no other. Okay, only liver tissue has this hexagonal arrangement of hepatocytes, which are themselves somewhat hexagonal. Okay, so you could think of this as a hexagon of hexagons, if you will. The blood that comes into the liver and is treated by the liver never actually touches the hepatocytes. And this is a thing called the blood-liver barrier. This is one of the reasons that the liver enjoys something known as immune privilege, meaning that if you need a liver in the event you've ruined your own, you don't have to have a perfect tissue match in order to get a replacement organ. All you need is somebody with the same blood type, and it will take. There's also oxygen-rich blood that comes into the back of the liver through the hepatic artery. Joins the hepatic portal vein, and what happens now is you get a combination of oxygen-rich and nutrient-rich blood flowing through these sinusoids, being treated by these hepatocytes, and eventually draining into these things called the central vein, which will eventually empty into the hepatic vein, which will empty into the inferior vena cava. At each vertex of the hexagon here, you see something called a triad, and the triad is dominated by a branch of the hepatic artery, a branch of the hepatic portal vein, and a branch of the bile duct. The bile duct, of course, receives the bile that the liver creates and sends it eventually to the gallbladder, where it's stored until it's needed when the food comes into the duodenum from the stomach. So the liver is made up of thousands of these all throughout the organ, all constantly cleaning your blood. Okay, wonderful organ, the liver, looks like nothing else. Um, In addition to that, liver also has an immunological function. I wanted to touch on that before we left. There are star-shaped macrophages known as Kupffer cells that patrol the liver, searching for pathogens. If they encounter them, they will engulf them, chop them into tiny pieces, and present them to the lymphatic system for defense against disease. So it's a lymphatic organ in addition to all its other purposes as well. In fact, the reason that the liver is called the liver is because without the liver you cannot live. Okay, that's where the name comes from. Now what you're looking at here is just a tissue section through ileum. Okay, the big purple areas here are Peyer's patches. You can see the villi here and the lamina propria, and you can see the muscularis mucosa all through here. Okay, that little kind of pink staining area in this little region. And there's a zoom up that'll show it even better here in the next few slides. Okay, but this is low magnification. Again, you got a lot of Peyer's patches in the ileum because, again, you've got significant numbers of bacteria in the food. Even though it's passed through the stomach, they're still in there and they present a danger. And these guys are on the defensive, guarding you against potential invasion and disease. And if you look here at the outermost layer, you can see the muscularis externa. You can see the inner circular layer, okay, and you can see the outer longitudinal layer if you really close in on the slide very closely. So this is very similar to the slides that you guys looked at in lab. And this is just a close-up of ileum, and what you can see here are the labeled areas. You can see the if we work from the outside in, okay, there's the muscularis externa, there's the outer longitudinal and inner circular layer. You can see it. And here you can see the lymphatic nodules, okay, the Peyer's patches in the submucosa, dominating the submucosa. And you see a lot of intestinal glands as well, peppered throughout here. A lot of blood vessels, of course. And there is the muscularis mucosa, okay. The way that you look for smooth muscle tissue, look for spindle-shaped cells stacked in layers, and that'll be a dead giveaway. Okay, there are the villi. Okay, you can see the columnar epithelia here, the lamina propria. Okay, very straightforward stuff. This is just a slice through the duodenum, and what you can see here again, there's mucosa. Okay, you can see the villi and the lamina propria. If you look closely, you can see goblet cells, and then here you can see the muscularis mucosa, very, very thin layer of smooth muscle running along here. All right, and there's the submucosa dominated by Brunner's glands. And what do Brunner's glands produce? Secretions that the duodenum needs in order to chemically break down your food. Okay, so these are a lot of the brush border enzymes in the mucus that are important in this region of the intestine in order for you to be able to chemically break down your food while allowing it easy passage through the organ. And here you can see the muscularis externa. Again, an inner circular and an outer longitudinal layer. And then, of course, the outermost layer of serosa. Okay, remember that serosa produces a serous fluid that lubricates the organ. And that's pretty much it for this slide. So the lumen would be over here, and the outside of the organ would be over here. Okay, if we were looking as an example. Here you can see a section through jejunum. You can see in the submucosal region a lack of duodenal glands and Peyer's patches. Okay, jejunum is primarily there to do what? Absorb. Okay, most of the chemical work has been done in the first 10 inches of duodenum, and those enzymes are basically washing down with the food as it passes through the rest of the tube. But notice how many villi we've got. Okay, we've got a lot of these little crypts here too, leading deep down into the mucosa. There's the submucosal region. All right, you can see it very clearly here, and the little dividing line, the little border right here, again would be the muscularis mucosa. And then there's the serosal layer, and if you look real close here, all right, you can see the inner circular and an outer longitudinal layer that dominates the muscularis externa, the serosa, of course, there to produce the lubricating fluid that lets the organ move without producing a lot of irritation and inflammation as it performs its job in the body. Okay, so we talked about the lymphatic system in the earlier podcast. We don't need to go back over all those components, but specifically with regard to what we talked about here, you want to be able to state the overall function of the digestive system, ID the organs and the models, the torsos, the charts, and the slides, define the bold terms in Chapter 25, describe the histology of the alimentary canal, be able to identify the pancreas and liver on a slide and in a model and tell me what they do, identify any structure listed on your checklist, and know the structure of the tooth. And really, a fun game to play with this system particularly is to imagine yourself as an article of food passing through the digestive system, and just have one of your study partners pick out a series of structures along the tract, and don't tell you what they are, and just kind of write them up there on a piece of paper on a chalkboard or something, and then try to arrange them in the proper order, okay, as the article of food goes from the mouth all the way out the anus, and see if you understand really how the digestive system is arranged, and how each of the organs do their particular tasks. Okay, that brings me to the end of what I wanted to talk about for this week. I'll see everybody. Uh, we're going first in the practical this week. Okay, so be there at 2:40, and we'll be good to go. All right, study hard. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.